Look around your house. Somewhere in a drawer or a dusty photo album, you probably have a small square picture with a thick white border. That simple white border was once the foundation of an absolute monopoly. In the late 1970s, Polaroid factories ran 24 hours a day. They churned out millions of complex chemical film packs, printing money faster than the executives could count it. Every time a shutter clicked anywhere in America, Polaroid got paid. Then, the factory floors went completely silent. The giant chemical vats were drained. Thousands of loyal workers were escorted out, and their life savings evaporated in a brutal bankruptcy. The prestigious brand that defined instant memories was stripped for parts and sold to stamp on cheap plastic televisions. How does an empire built entirely on instant gratification completely destroy itself right at the dawn of the digital age? Chapter 1: The 60-Second Miracle. Santa Fe, New Mexico. The year is 1943. The sun sits heavy over the desert landscape. Edwin Land holds a Rolleiflex camera. He is a scientist, an inventor, and a man who observes the world through the strict laws of physics and light. He points the lens at his 3-year-old daughter, Jennifer. He takes her picture. She looks at the metal box. She looks at her father. She asks a very simple question. Why can't I see the picture right now? It is a child's question. It exposes a massive flaw in the adult world. In 1943, photography demands extreme patience. You load a roll of film in the dark. You shoot the pictures. You take the fragile roll to a pharmacy or a professional darkroom. Technicians work in rooms lit only by dull red bulbs. They process the negative film in harsh chemical baths. They project light through that negative onto sensitive paper. They wash the paper in a developer solution, then a stop bath, and finally a fixer. They hang the wet prints on lines to dry. The entire process takes days. You do not see the picture right now. You wait. The moment passes, and the physical memory arrives a week later. Land does not dismiss his daughter's question. He leaves his family and walks alone around the quiet desert town. He thinks about the physics of optics. He considers the complex chemistry of silver halides. He does not accept the current limits of technology. Within a few hours of walking, the fundamental concept of instant photography takes shape in his mind. He envisions a camera that acts as a portable, mechanical darkroom. He pictures a machine that develops the image entirely inside its own body, instantly. This vision requires a chemical miracle. It requires a mechanical impossibility. Land returns to Cambridge, Massachusetts. He commands a brilliant team of scientists at his company, Polaroid. They are already successful. They manufactured polarizing filters for Allied bombers during World War II. They built glare-resistant goggles for combat troops. But the war is ending. America is changing rapidly. The nation is redirecting its massive industrial capacity toward consumer goods. The American public expects science to deliver a utopian future right into their living rooms. They want jet airplanes, televisions, and modern appliances. Land wants to give them a piece of paper that holds a memory instantly. The development process is brutal. Land operates with intense secrecy. His team works behind locked doors in Cambridge. They call the secret initiative Project SX70. The core challenge is containment. They need to invent a tiny chemical pod that holds a highly reactive developer and fixer. This pod must sit inside the unexposed film roll. When the user pulls the film out of the camera, 2 precision steel rollers must crush the pod. The rollers must squeeze the viscous chemical jelly evenly across the paper. The layer of chemicals must be exactly 3/10,000ths of an inch thick. If the layer is too thick, the image blurs into a dark mess. If the layer is too thin, the image fails to develop. If the pod leaks inside the camera mechanism, the highly caustic chemicals will destroy the machine entirely. They fail hundreds of times. The chemistry remains unstable. The jelly dries out too fast. The steel rollers jam. The paper sticks together. But Land pushes his engineers to the breaking point, and he operates on a philosophy of absolute, unbending belief. He refuses to accept impossible as a scientific conclusion. He works long into the night, sleeping on cots in the laboratory. His employees stay with him. They idolize his vision. They refuse to let him down. After years of exhaustion and millions of dollars spent, the chemistry finally aligns. The mechanical gears synchronize. They build a working prototype. They name it the Polaroid Land Camera Model 95. The machine does not look like a toy. It is a serious, formidable piece of equipment. It weighs over 4 pounds. It features a heavy metal body covered in brown leatherette and a folding bellows system. It feels solid and cold in the hands. It is an instrument of pure precision. The date is the 26th of November 1948. The setting is the Jordan Marsh department store in downtown Boston. It is the day after Thanksgiving. The holiday shopping season is starting. Polaroid sets up a small display counter near the front of the store. They bring exactly 56 cameras. The retail price is $89.75 in 1948. That is a very significant amount of money. It equals nearly a week of wages for an average American worker. The Polaroid executives are incredibly nervous. They predict the 56 cameras will last on the shelf until Christmas. They worry the price is too high for a post-war economy. They fear the public will simply not understand how the complicated machine works. Edwin Land stands at the counter. He does not shout or use cheap sales tactics. He simply demonstrates the machine to the passing shoppers. He points the heavy metal camera. He presses the shutter button. A loud mechanical click cuts through the ambient noise of the department store. Then, the physical action begins. Land grips a paper tab extending from the back of the camera. He pulls it firmly. Inside the heavy metal body, the steel rollers crush the hidden chemical pod. The jelly spreads invisibly. Land holds up a piece of plain white paper. A crowd gathers around him. They watch the blank sheet. Land tells them to wait. 60 seconds pass. In a bustling, crowded department store, 60 seconds is an eternity to stare at a piece of white paper. The anticipation builds. The silence around the small counter deepens as more people stop to watch. At exactly 1 minute, Land grabs the edge of the paper and peels back the top layer. He reveals the image underneath. It is a sepia-toned photograph. It is perfectly sharp. It is completely dry and permanent. The exact subject he just photographed is right there, captured flawlessly. There is no dark room, no red lights, no waiting for days, and no liquid chemical baths. The crowd erupts. The impossible just happened right in front of their eyes. The fundamental logic of photography has been shattered in a single minute. The long gap between a lived experience and the physical memory of that experience has been completely erased. The nervous executives were wrong about their inventory. The 56 cameras do not last until Christmas. They do not last until the end of the week. They sell out in minutes. The crowd pushes forward aggressively, demanding more cameras. People wave cash in the air. The department store management has to turn them away. The Model 95 becomes an immediate sensation. It transcends being just a retail product. It becomes a massive cultural phenomenon. It taps into a deep, unspoken human desire for instant gratification. It allows ordinary people to hold a piece of modern magic in their hands. Polaroid is no longer just an anonymous military contractor. It transforms overnight into the creator of the most desired consumer object in America. The massive factories in Massachusetts prepare to run their assembly lines at full capacity. The cash begins to flow in like a tidal wave. The era of the instant image has officially begun, and Edwin Land has built the perfect machine to capture it. Chapter 2. The White-Bordered Money Machine. The Model 95 sold out in minutes. The initial batch vanished before the executives could comprehend the scale of their success. But Edwin Land understood something far more profound than retail metrics. He knew he had not just invented a new camera. He had invented a perpetual revenue engine. The business model was incredibly simple and devastatingly effective. It mirrored the logic of the safety razor. You sell the razor at a low price, sometimes even at a loss, and you make your fortune on the disposable blades. For Polaroid, the heavy metal camera was the razor. The complex, chemically loaded film pack was the blade. Every time a user pressed the shutter, they consumed a piece of Polaroid's proprietary inventory. They could not buy cheaper film from a competitor. The chemistry and the mechanics were locked behind hundreds of ironclad patents. If you owned a Polaroid camera, you paid the Polaroid tax for every single memory you chose to capture. To feed this new model, the company needed scale. They needed factories. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Polaroid transformed the industrial landscape of Massachusetts. They built massive manufacturing complexes in Waltham and Cambridge. These were not just assembly plants for metal and glass. They were giant, highly controlled chemical laboratories. Inside these buildings, thousands of workers managed massive vats of proprietary developer jelly. They operated giant coating machines that applied microscopic layers of light-sensitive compounds onto continuous rolls of paper. The air inside the factories smelled of solvents and metallic silver. The noise of the rollers and the cutting machines formed a constant industrial rhythm. Polaroid hired chemists, mechanical engineers, and thousands of assembly line workers. They offered good wages, excellent benefits, and a sense of participation in the future. The workers punched in, mixed the chemistry, packed the foil wrappers, and shipped millions of film rolls to drugstores and camera shops across the country. The film itself evolved. The early peel-apart film was messy. Users had to time the development process precisely. They had to peel a damp, chemical-coated negative away from the positive print and throw the negative away. It left chemical residue on fingers. It created toxic trash at parties and family gatherings. But the public did not care. The magic of instant gratification outweighed the inconvenience. By the late 1960s, the white-bordered photograph became a cultural staple. It stopped being a novelty and became an absolute necessity. Parents used it to capture the first moments of a newborn. Police officers used it to document crime scenes instantly. Insurance adjusters used it to record accident damage. Artists like Andy Warhol adopted the medium, fascinated by its raw, immediate nature. Photography shifted from a planned, formal activity into a spontaneous, reckless action. People took pictures of things they never would have photographed before, simply because they could see the result immediately. The white border itself became iconic. It was originally designed purely out of mechanical necessity. The camera needed a place to grip the paper, to pull it through the rollers. The borders housed the chemical pod at the bottom and trapped the excess jelly at the top. But soon, that white frame defined the aesthetic of a generation. It provided a space to write a date, a name, or a quick note. The physical artifact of a Polaroid picture felt unique. You could not order reprints. There was no negative to duplicate. The picture you held in your hand was the exact physical object that was present at the moment the shutter opened. It possessed an inherent authenticity that traditional film lacked. But Edwin Land was not satisfied. He hated the messy peel-apart process. He hated the chemical trash. He demanded absolute elegance. He believed the camera should be an extension of the eye, and the photograph should materialize as effortlessly as a thought. He gathered his top engineers and scientists and issued a new, impossible directive. He wanted a camera that folded flat enough to fit into a suit pocket. He wanted a camera that required zero timing and zero peeling. He wanted the user to press a single button, and the camera would automatically eject a dry, sealed picture that developed in broad daylight. His engineers thought he was insane. The chemistry required to develop a picture in bright sunlight without fogging the image was entirely unknown. The complex folding optics required precise mirrors and lenses that did not exist, but Land pushed them exactly as he had pushed them in 1943. He authorized hundreds of millions of dollars for research and development. The project consumed the company. It became an obsession that bordered on madness. They invented new chemical compounds from scratch. They developed a completely new opacifying layer. This layer remained dark while the picture ejected from the camera, protecting the sensitive silver halides from the sun. Then, as the image developed beneath it, the layer slowly turned transparent. It was a chemical curtain that opened to reveal the photograph. In 1972, Polaroid introduced the SX70. It was a masterpiece. It featured a brushed chrome body and genuine leather panels. It collapsed into a flat, elegant rectangle. When the user pulled it open, a complex array of mirrors snapped into place. The user looked directly through the lens. They focused. They pressed the red button. A motor whined. The camera spat out a square picture with a thick white border. The picture was completely dry. It looked like a gray blank square. Then, slowly, the colors materialized. The image faded in like a ghost appearing in a window. It required no peeling, no timing, and left no trash. It was pure, unadulterated magic. The SX70 pushed Polaroid to the absolute peak of its power. The public bought the expensive camera, and more importantly, they bought the expensive film by the truckload. Revenue skyrocketed into the billions. The stock price soared. The Massachusetts factories ran at maximum capacity, churning out millions of the new integral film packs. The money machine operated flawlessly. Every click of an SX70 generated pure profit. At this moment, Polaroid seemed invincible. They held a complete monopoly on instant photography. They had defeated Kodak in court. They owned the patents, the factories, and the culture. They had built an empire on a simple, brilliant premise. They controlled the camera and they controlled the film, but within the walls of their massive research facilities, the seeds of their own destruction were already being planted. The very model that made them billions was about to become a prison. Chapter 3: The Curse of Perfection. Success creates a dangerous kind of blindness. By the late 1970s, Polaroid possessed absolute market dominance. The company generated over $1 billion in annual revenue. The brand name was synonymous with instant gratification. Edwin Land was recognized globally as a billionaire and a visionary inventor, on par with Thomas Edison. But a visionary always needs a new horizon to conquer. Land did not want to simply iterate on the SX70 camera. He wanted to bend time and motion to his will. He wanted to create instant movies. He named this new obsession Polavision. The fundamental concept was an act of extreme hubris. Land wanted to replicate the magic of the instant photograph, but apply it to motion pictures. He envisioned a physical cassette. The user would insert this cassette into a heavy camera, shoot the movie, remove the cassette, and drop it directly into a specialized tabletop player. Exactly 90 seconds later, the movie would play on a bright screen. This system relied entirely on the same chemical principles that built his empire. The Polavision cassette contained a tiny, fragile pod of developer fluid hidden inside the plastic housing. When the user dropped the cassette into the player, a mechanical arm engaged. It rewound the exposed film ribbon, crushed the chemical pod, and squeezed the highly reactive fluid across the film surface. Loss. A high-intensity bulb then projected light through the freshly developed film onto the screen. It was an astonishing mechanical triumph. It was also a commercial suicide mission. While Land locked himself inside his Cambridge laboratory, perfecting his complex chemical pods, the rest of the technology world was turning toward electronics. Companies in Japan like Sony and JVC were heavily investing in magnetic tape. They were building the video home system, commonly known as VHS, and the Betamax format. Magnetic tape recorded hours of video rather than minutes. It recorded synchronized sound, and it required absolutely no complex chemical development process. A user could record a television program, wipe the magnetic tape clean, and record over it the next day. Land despised magnetic video. He considered electronic imaging to be low resolution, artificial, and entirely lacking the physical magic of a tangible photograph. He forced his entire corporation to ignore electronics and doubled down on chemistry. He staked his reputation and the financial reserves of Polaroid on proving that analog film was superior. The development of Polavision consumed an estimated $500 million. It drained the company resources and distracted the top scientific minds. Engineers worked frantically to solve impossible chemical puzzles. To make the instant film work, it required an incredibly dense layer of microscopic color filters. Because these filters were so thick and dark, the camera lens needed massive amounts of light to properly expose the film ribbon. If a parent wanted to film a child cutting a birthday cake indoors, they had to mount blazing hot floodlights to the top of the camera. The subjects had to squint into blinding light just to be recorded. When Polavision finally launched in 1977, the reality of the product violently collided with the reality of the consumer market. The complete system cost nearly $700. The blank film cassettes cost $10 each. A single $10 cassette recorded exactly 2 minutes and 35 seconds of footage. The film captured zero audio. It was a silent movie system, released at the dawn of the home video era. The screen on the player was small and dim. The film could not be edited, spliced, or copied easily to share with family members. Consumers looked at Polavision on the department store shelves. Then they looked at the new VCRs arriving from Japan. A VCR cost roughly the same amount of money. A blank VHS tape cost $20, but recorded 2 full hours of video with perfect synchronized sound. The choice was not difficult for the American public. Polavision sat dead on store shelves. The massive production lines in Massachusetts kept churning out the complex hardware and the chemical cassettes, but the reorders from retailers completely stopped. Warehouses filled to the ceiling with unsold, decaying inventory. Retailers began shipping the products back to Cambridge in massive quantities. Inside Polaroid headquarters, the corporate atmosphere turned toxic. The board of directors had previously been entirely compliant to Land's every wish. Now, they panicked. The company was bleeding cash at an unprecedented rate. The core instant photography business was still highly profitable, but Polavision was acting as a massive financial sinkhole, threatening the entire enterprise. Executives, who had spent decades agreeing with Land, suddenly started challenging him in meetings. They pointed at the disastrous sales figures. They pointed at the rising dominance of Japanese electronics companies. They demanded an immediate end to the Polavision project. Land refused to yield. He argued that the public simply needed more time to understand the elegant physics of his invention. He firmly believed that a massive marketing campaign could fix a fundamental product flaw. He could not accept that the world had moved past his mastery of chemistry. The financial reality forced the issue. In 1979, Polaroid had to take a massive write-down on their useless Polavision inventory. They officially recognized a loss of $68 million, though the true development and manufacturing costs were hundreds of millions higher. The board of directors acted decisively. They stripped Land of his title as president and chief executive officer. It was a corporate coup executed against the brilliant founder. Land retreated. He retained the ceremonial title of chairman, but his absolute operational control was gone forever. The company he had built from a garage laboratory into a global empire had fundamentally rejected his final grand vision. He stopped attending daily management meetings. He isolated himself in his office and refused to speak to the executives who had ousted him. In 1982, Edwin Land resigned from the board of directors completely. He sold nearly all of his Polaroid stock. He walked away from the massive factories, the research labs, and the thousands of employees who still revered him. He founded a new, small research institute dedicated solely to pure science. He never set foot in a Polaroid building again. Years later, he even refused to attend the company's lavish 50th anniversary celebration. The departure of Edwin Land removed the creative engine from Polaroid. The company survived the Polavision disaster only because their core instant film business remained a massive cash generator. People still bought the cameras and the expensive white-bordered film. The money machine still worked, but the visionary leader was gone. The executives who took control were not inventors. They were traditional corporate managers, accountants, and marketing directors. They knew exactly how to optimize a supply chain and how to run a promotional campaign. They did not know how to invent the future. Polaroid entered the 1980s as a highly profitable company without a compass. They had perfected the physical photograph. They had built an impenetrable fortress based on chemistry, patents, and mechanical engineering. They had effectively walled themselves inside their own massive success. But outside those thick factory walls, the digital revolution was quietly gathering incredible speed. The era of the pixel was rapidly approaching, and Polaroid was now completely run by men who only understood how to sell paper. Chapter 4: The Buried Digital Future. Deep in the shadows of the massive chemical plants in Massachusetts, a completely different kind of work was taking place. A small, isolated group of engineers at Polaroid did not stare at vats of developer fluid. They stared at silicon wafers. By the early 1980s, these scientists understood a brutal truth about the physical world. The physics of light capture were changing fundamentally. They saw the rapid advancement of microelectronics. They knew that eventually a digital sensor would entirely replace the chemical pod. They built a small microelectronics laboratory. They started experimenting with capturing images purely as digital data. Their progress was steady and remarkable. While the rest of the corporation obsessed over making the white border on a physical photograph slightly sharper, this small team developed early electronic sensors. They built prototype digital imaging devices. These machines did not need physical film. They did not need toxic chemical jelly. They captured light through a lens and converted it instantly into numbers. The image could be viewed immediately on an electronic display. It was the absolute realization of Edwin Land's original vision of instant photography. It was faster, cleaner, and ultimately cheaper. The engineers brought their findings to the executive boardroom. They presented a clear, undeniable path to the future. They explained that the world was moving toward electronic imaging and that photography would soon be entirely digital. They expected the executives to embrace the new technology. They expected Polaroid to lead the digital revolution, exactly as they had led the instant film revolution. They miscalculated the culture of their own company. The boardroom did not react with applause or excitement. They reacted with profound terror. The executives looked at the digital prototype and saw a mortal threat, not a savior. The entire Polaroid empire rested on a razor and blade business model. The heavy mechanical cameras were the cheap razors. The complex, chemically loaded film packs were the expensive blades. Every time a user pressed the shutter, they consumed a piece of Polaroid's proprietary inventory. Film sales generated roughly 65% of the total company profit margins. It was a perfect, closed-loop system. It paid for the massive factories, the thousands of union workers, the executive bonuses, and the global marketing campaigns. If a camera did not need film, the entire financial structure of the Polaroid Corporation collapsed instantly. A digital camera captured an image for free. It consumed no physical material. It generated no recurring revenue. To the men running the financial spreadsheet, the digital camera was not an innovation. It was a virus. A quiet, brutal war started inside the corporate headquarters. The engineers argued desperately for survival. They pointed at electronic companies in Japan and Silicon Valley. They warned that if Polaroid did not lead the digital imaging market, a competitor would use the technology to destroy them. They argued that a company must be willing to cannibalize its own products to survive a massive technological shift. The accountants, the marketing directors, and the factory managers argued for stability. They looked at the current quarterly earnings reports. The cash flowing from the sales of physical film was still massive. The factories were running at full capacity. They asked a simple, fatal question. Why would we actively kill our most profitable product simply to sell a digital camera that requires absolutely no film? The corporate culture at Polaroid was deeply rooted in chemistry. The top executives understood fluid dynamics, paper coatings, and complex mechanical rollers. They did not understand microprocessors, binary code, or electronic displays. When forced to choose between a physical product they completely understood and a digital concept they feared, they chose the familiar path. The accountants won the war. The executive leadership made a deliberate, calculated choice to ignore the digital future. They did not just pause the electronic research, they actively suppressed it. They cut the budget for the microelectronics laboratory. They marginalized the brilliant engineers who had built the prototypes. They reassigned those scientists to work on minor, insignificant improvements for the existing chemical film lines. They ordered the factory floor managers to increase the production of the standard instant film packs. They bet the entire existence of the corporation on the arrogant belief that consumers would always prefer a physical piece of paper over a digital file on a screen. They approved budgets to build new, massive coating machines. These machines were hundreds of feet long, designed to apply microscopic layers of silver halide onto continuous ribbons of plastic. They invested millions in optimizing the exact viscosity of the developer jelly. They hired more mechanical engineers to design slightly quieter gears for the film ejection motors. Every dollar spent on these physical, mechanical perfections was a dollar stolen from their electronic future. The executive board essentially doubled down on the past. They truly believed that if they made the chemical picture slightly sharper or slightly more colorful, the public would simply ignore the convenience of digital technology. They confused the physical artifact with the actual human desire. People did not inherently want a piece of chemically treated paper. They wanted the memory instantly. The engineers in the basement understood this distinction. The men in the boardroom did not. Throughout the late 1980s, this defensive strategy looked correct on paper. Corporate revenue remained extremely high. The giant industrial plants in Waltham and Cambridge ran continuously, around the clock. Forklifts carried millions of chemical pods to distribution centers every single day. The company felt perfectly safe. They lived comfortably inside a walled garden made of ironclad patents and massive profit margins. But it was a pure illusion. They were mass-producing a product that belonged to a dying era. They had the technology to survive the coming storm right in their own hands, and they chose to bury it in the basement. It remains a classic corporate tragedy. Polaroid had the financial resources. They had the top scientific talent. They had a global brand name built entirely on the concept of instant results. A digital camera is the ultimate instant camera. It shows the image on a screen immediately. It requires no waiting, no peeling, and no chemicals. Polaroid should have easily dominated the digital age. Instead, they built a massive wall against it. The factories kept printing physical film. The executives kept counting the physical profits, but the momentum of the world was shifting decisively. Every day, they delayed. Their competitors gained ground. The digital sensors in other corporate laboratories grew cheaper, smaller, and more powerful. The silence from the Polaroid research division gave every other electronics company the exact opening they needed. The giant chemical machine kept moving forward, entirely blind to the cliff approaching quickly in the distance. The men in charge successfully protected their short-term quarterly bonuses. In doing so, they signed the death warrant for the entire corporation. Chapter 5. The End of the Century Delirium. The 1990s brought a new, ruthless logic to corporate America. Wall Street investors no longer cared about 50-year visions or slow, methodical scientific breakthroughs. They demanded immediate, quarterly growth. They wanted higher dividends and surging stock prices every 3 months. Polaroid felt this intense pressure constantly. The new executives running the company looked at their balance sheets with growing anxiety. The core patent monopolies that had protected them for decades were finally expiring. Competitors like Kodak and Fuji had successfully chipped away at the edges of the instant film market. The digital threat remained securely locked in the basement laboratory, deliberately ignored by management. The executives needed a massive, quick influx of cash to satisfy the shareholders and protect their own positions. They decided to completely strip mine their own brand identity to get it. For decades, Polaroid cameras represented precision and elegance. The Model 95 and the SX70 were sophisticated optical instruments built for serious adults. They featured glass lenses, brushed metal bodies, and complex folding mechanisms. The boardroom discarded that legacy entirely. They pivoted their massive manufacturing apparatus toward cheap, disposable novelties. They designed cameras entirely out of bright neon plastic. They stripped away all the complex optics. They replaced precision glass with cheap molded plastic lenses. They removed the folding mechanisms and created bulky, rigid plastic shells that felt like hollow toys. They slapped aggressive, youthful names on them, like the Cool Cam, the Joy Cam, and the Spice Cam, officially tying their historic legacy to a British pop music group. They targeted teenagers and children. The business calculation behind this pivot was cynical but highly effective in the short term. They manufactured the plastic cameras for pennies on the dollar. They sold them at deep retail discounts. They knew teenagers would beg their parents to buy the heavily marked up film packs to capture weekend parties, school dances, and trips to the mall. They traded prestige for sheer volume. The massive factories in Waltham and Cambridge violently changed their daily rhythm. They stopped assembling complex mechanical parts. They started snapping together cheap plastic shells by the millions. The assembly lines sped up to a frantic pace. The focus shifted completely from quality control to raw volume output. The veteran engineers who remembered the intense, secretive days of Edwin Land watched the transformation with disgust. They saw their life's work reduced to a brightly colored gimmick, but the line supervisors demanded speed. The massive coating machines ran 24 hours a day, churning out the chemical film to feed this new, younger demographic. All F. The problem line. Polaroid flooded retail stores like Kmart, Walmart, and Target with these neon plastic boxes. They bought massive amounts of television advertising space. They sponsored music concerts and heavily branded MTV events. They pumped pop culture saturation into the market to force the product into the hands of youth. For a brief window in the late 1990s, the delirium worked perfectly. Revenue spiked dramatically. Teenagers bought the cheap cameras on impulse. The expensive film packs flew off the shelves at local pharmacies and supermarkets. Wall Street analysts praised the Polaroid management team for brilliantly revitalizing an aging brand. The executives collected massive performance bonuses based on the surging quarterly reports. They congratulated themselves for unlocking a massive, highly profitable new demographic. They believed they had outsmarted the changing market dynamics. Most dangerously, they used this temporary surge in cash flow to justify their absolute refusal to invest in digital technology. They argued aggressively in board meetings that the physical film market was not dying at all. They claimed it was simply evolving into a younger, more vibrant consumer base that preferred physical artifacts over computer files. But teenagers are a notoriously fickle demographic, and novelty items possess a very short, unforgiving lifespan. The neon cameras were bulky to carry. The film remained incredibly expensive for a high school allowance. Taking 10 pictures cost nearly $15. The initial excitement of the instant toy faded quickly when the financial reality set in. The bright plastic cameras ended up pushed to the back of teenage closets alongside other forgotten trends. The repeat film purchasing stopped completely. The executives had built a massive corporate strategy entirely on a passing fad, and the fad ended abruptly. Retailers noticed the sudden, sharp drop in consumer demand immediately. Store managers at major retail chains stopped placing reorders for both cameras and film. They aggressively discounted the existing inventory just to clear valuable shelf space. But the executives in Cambridge blatantly refused to adjust their massive production schedules. They convinced themselves it was just a temporary, seasonal dip. They ordered the factories to keep running at absolute maximum capacity. They mandated the continued assembly of millions of plastic cameras and millions of chemical film packs, refusing to slow down the machines. The physical reality of their massive miscalculation began to manifest directly in their logistics network. The primary distribution centers filled up completely within weeks. When the main warehouses reached total capacity, Polaroid desperately leased secondary storage facilities across the state. The delivery trucks stopped arriving at the retail loading docks and simply diverted to these overflow warehouses. Inside massive, climate-controlled buildings spread across Massachusetts, millions of brightly colored plastic cameras sat stacked on wooden pallets. They stretched out in endless rows, reaching 30 feet high toward the steel rafters. Hundreds of millions of dollars in completely unsold inventory gathered dust in the dark. It was a staggering monument to corporate denial. The situation was far worse than just static inventory. The chemical pods inside the millions of film packs had strict expiration dates. The developer jelly would eventually dry out and ruin the product. They were literally ticking time bombs of lost revenue. The massive cash flow that had easily sustained the company for 50 uninterrupted years began to freeze solid. The company was bleeding vast amounts of money simply to store plastic products that absolutely nobody wanted to buy. Yet, inside the isolated executive suites, the corporate delusion held firm. The leadership team blamed poor marketing execution. They blamed retail shelf placement. They blamed minor economic fluctuations. They blamed everything except the fundamental, undeniable irrelevance of their core product line. No one in the boardroom possessed the professional courage to hit the panic button. No one dared to speak the obvious truth aloud and admit that the great white-bordered money machine was finally broken. They simply commanded the forklifts to stack the bright plastic boxes higher into the warehouse rafters, and they blindly waited for a market turnaround that would never come. Chapter 6. The Shock of the Pixels. The calendar turned to the year 2000. A new millennium arrived. It brought a completely new method of human communication. The internet rapidly expanded from university laboratories into regular American living rooms. Personal computers became household appliances. Dial-up connections evolved into broadband networks. This infrastructure shift fundamentally changed how people interacted with information. It also completely destroyed the core value proposition of a physical Polaroid photograph. For 50 years, the white-bordered picture held a monopoly on immediate sharing. If you took a picture at a party, you handed the physical object directly to your friend. The internet digitized that exact social interaction. Suddenly, a consumer could take a digital picture, plug a cable into a computer, and send that image to 50 friends across the country in seconds. They did not need to buy stamps. For stamps, they did not need envelopes. They certainly did not need expensive, chemically treated paper. The pixel replaced the physical print. At the same time, the hardware side of the digital revolution accelerated. Electronics companies in Japan and South Korea aggressively optimized their manufacturing processes. They drove the cost of digital sensors down. They mass-produced memory cards. Early digital cameras were expensive and clumsy. By the early 2000s, they became affordable, compact, and highly reliable. Consumers calculated the costs quickly. A digital camera required a higher initial purchase price. But after that purchase, taking a picture cost absolutely nothing. A user could take 1,000 photos, delete the bad ones, and keep the good ones without spending another dime. The Polaroid model required a consumer to pay a heavy tax for every single press of the shutter, regardless of the picture quality. The economic logic shifted permanently. Inside the massive Polaroid headquarters in Massachusetts, the mood shifted from arrogant denial to sheer panic. The executives finally looked at the declining sales charts. The numbers did not show a temporary dip. They showed a catastrophic structural collapse. The neon plastic cameras sat rotting in the overflow warehouses. The expensive film packs expired on store shelves. The massive cash flow that had funded their salaries, their bonuses, and their vast factories began to evaporate. The boardroom demanded an immediate response. They needed a digital product. But they had spent the previous 2 decades intentionally starving their own microelectronics research laboratory. They had chased off their best digital engineers. They lacked the internal infrastructure, the patents, and the expertise to build a competitive digital camera from scratch. They were a chemical company, trapped in an electronic war. They chose the fastest, most desperate path available. They abandoned their legacy of precision engineering. They outsourced their survival. Polaroid executives signed contracts with cheap electronics manufacturers in Asia. They bought generic, low-quality digital cameras in massive bulk quantities. These cameras possessed terrible sensors and cheap plastic lenses. They lacked any real innovation. Polaroid simply printed their famous rainbow logo on the plastic shells and shipped them to American retailers. It was a humiliating surrender. The company that had once employed the greatest optical scientists in the world was now essentially a generic brand licensing operation. Consumers recognized the deception immediately. The public remembered Polaroid for the absolute magic of the SX70. They saw these new digital products for exactly what they were. The cheap cameras failed to capture any market share. They sat on the shelves right next to the unsold instant film. Competitors like Sony, Canon, and Nikon dominated the new digital landscape. They had spent decades perfecting electronic imaging, while Polaroid was busy mixing developer jelly. The technological gap was far too wide to close with a rebranded toy. The failure of their digital strategy exposed the fatal weakness of their entire corporate structure. Polaroid was built to manufacture chemistry at a massive scale. They operated giant factories in Waltham and New Bedford. They employed thousands of unionized workers. They maintained an incredibly complex, expensive, global supply chain designed specifically to move temperature-sensitive chemicals and specialized paper. This entire physical apparatus required a constant, massive stream of cash to survive. When the film sales stopped, the blood drained from the corporate body. The supply chain began to crush them. They had contracted with external suppliers for raw silver and specialized chemicals. Those contracts required minimum purchase orders. The chemicals arrived at the loading docks. The factories had to accept them, but they had nowhere to put the finished products. The warehouses were already overflowing with unsold inventory. The factory managers had to shut down the giant coating machines. The loud, rhythmic noise of the assembly lines went silent. Thousands of workers stood around on the factory floors with nothing to do. The company continued to pay their salaries, their health insurance, and their pension contributions while the revenue plummeted. The executives desperately tried to secure new credit lines from major banks to keep the operations running. They begged for short-term loans just to meet the weekly payroll. The banks looked at the financial data. They saw a company with enormous fixed costs, an outdated core product, and absolutely no viable strategy to compete in the new digital economy. The banks tightened the credit lines. They demanded higher interest rates. The financial walls closed in rapidly. The executives ordered emergency layoffs. They fired thousands of factory workers. They halted production lines completely. But cutting jobs could not fix the structural deficit. The company carried nearly $1 billion in debt. The interest payments alone required millions of dollars every month in pure cash. They could not generate that cash selling rebranded digital cameras. They certainly could not generate it selling expired instant film. By the late summer of 2001, the situation became critical. The company missed major debt payments. The stock price, which had once defined American corporate success and traded at nearly $60 a share, collapsed to pennies. Suppliers officially stopped sending raw materials. Retailers actively returned unsold inventory and demanded immediate refunds. The great white bordered money machine was not just broken, it was actively cannibalizing itself. The executives who had prioritized short-term profits over long-term survival finally ran out of time. They stood at the very edge of the abyss, completely out of options, and realized that their vast chemical empire was finally falling. Chapter 7. The Fatal Filing. The 12th of October, 2001. The end did not arrive with a dramatic explosion or a sudden mechanical failure. It arrived quietly on a Friday morning with a thick stack of legal paperwork filed in a Delaware court. Polaroid Corporation, the company that taught the world how to hold a memory instantly, officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The massive financial engine finally seized completely. The immediate consequences hit the factory floors like a physical shockwave. Banks froze the corporate accounts immediately. Suppliers halted all shipments of raw silver and specialized chemicals. The massive delivery trucks stopped pulling into the loading docks in Massachusetts. Without raw materials, the giant coating machines had to shut down. The rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of the Waltham and New Bedford plants stopped. A heavy, unnatural silence fell over millions of square feet of industrial space. Inside the executive suites, a different kind of reality unfolded. The top leadership team, the very men who had aggressively ignored the digital revolution and steered the company directly into a financial cliff, prepared their exit strategies. They did not face financial ruin. They hired expensive lawyers to negotiate their severance packages. They successfully secured millions of dollars in executive bonuses right before the bankruptcy filing became public. They claimed these retention bonuses were absolutely necessary to keep the leadership stable during the restructuring process. They walked away from the burning empire with their personal wealth entirely intact. The thousands of workers on the factory floor faced a completely different fate. When the bankruptcy court took control, the legal hierarchy of debt restructuring activated. The massive Wall Street banks and the major bondholders stood at the absolute front of the line. The union workers and the retirees stood at the back. The court approved the immediate termination of thousands of jobs. Workers who had spent 20 or 30 years operating the complex chemical vats received their layoff notices. They packed up their lockers. They walked out of the massive concrete buildings for the last time. The company cut off their health insurance instantly. But the deepest betrayal involved the retirement funds. For decades, Polaroid employees had invested heavily in the company's stock plan. They believed in the brand. They trusted the legacy of Edwin Land. The company actively encouraged this loyalty, often matching retirement contributions with more Polaroid stock. When the stock price collapsed from nearly $60 a share down to 28 cents, those life savings simply evaporated. Men and women in their 60s, expecting a comfortable retirement built on decades of loyal factory labor, opened their financial statements and found absolutely nothing. The wealth they had physically manufactured with their own hands was gone. The liquidation process began. It was not a restructuring designed to save the core business. It was a brutal, methodical dismantling of a physical empire to satisfy impatient creditors. The court appointed liquidation experts to strip the company down to its most valuable parts. They did not care about the history of the Model 95. They did not care about the elegant engineering of the SX-70. They looked at the massive factories and saw only scrap metal and real estate. Contractors arrived at the Waltham complex with heavy cutting torches and industrial cranes. They entered the restricted clean rooms, where engineers had once perfected the microscopic layers of instant film. They dismantled the giant coating machines piece by piece. These machines were custom-built marvels of mid-century engineering. They had produced billions of iconic, white-bordered photographs. They had captured weddings, crime scenes, historical events, and everyday American life for 50 years. Now, salvage crews cut them into manageable blocks of steel. Forklifts carried the heavy pieces out to waiting trucks. They sold the metal by the ton to local scrapyards. The physical destruction erased the legacy completely. They drained the massive chemical holding tanks. They stripped the valuable copper wiring from the walls. They ripped the specialized plumbing out of the concrete floors. Within a few short months, the buzzing, frantic heart of the Polaroid manufacturing empire became a hollow, echoing cavern. The salvage experts then turned to the intellectual property. The physical cameras were worthless, but the Polaroid brand name still carried massive cultural weight. The court auctioned off the name, the iconic rainbow logo, and the remaining patents. A private holding company bought the rights. This new corporate entity had absolutely no connection to Edwin Land. They did not own any factories. They did not employ any optical scientists. They simply bought the legal right to slap the trusted Polaroid logo onto generic consumer electronics produced in foreign sweatshops. The original Polaroid Corporation essentially ceased to exist as a true manufacturing entity. It became a ghost, haunting the aisles of discount electronics stores printed on cheap televisions and digital frames. The massive factory gates in Massachusetts locked permanently. Weeds began to push through the cracked asphalt in the vast, empty employee parking lots. The large corporate signs faded in the harsh New England weather. The physical footprint of a company that once defined American innovation slowly decayed into industrial ruins. Thousands of former employees scattered into a harsh job market. They carried deep physical knowledge of chemical mixing and paper coating, but the modern economy had absolutely no use for those specific skills. The digital age had arrived fully, and it demanded software engineers, not chemical technicians. The Polaroid workers became collateral damage in a technological war their own leaders had completely refused to fight. The bankruptcy of Polaroid stands as a brutal testament to the unforgiving nature of technological progress. It proves that past success offers absolutely zero protection against future irrelevance. The company built the perfect machine for the 20th century, and they died because they refused to let that machine go. They chose to protect their massive monopoly until the very final moment. They held onto the physical photograph so tightly that it ultimately dragged them completely underwater. Chapter 8. The Prison of Success. When a multi-billion-dollar industrial empire dies, it leaves behind a massive, complicated corpse. Lawyers and financial liquidators spent years picking over the bones of the Polaroid Corporation. They auctioned off the remaining patents. They sold the leftover chemical stockpiles for pennies on the dollar. They emptied the corporate bank accounts to pay off the secured creditors and Wall Street banks. The original company, the brilliant scientific entity that Edwin Land built in a garage in 1937, dissolved completely. It ceased to exist as a living, breathing organization. The most tragic part of the liquidation process involved the famous brand name. A series of private holding companies bought the Polaroid trademark and the iconic rainbow stripe logo. These new owners did not buy any manufacturing equipment. They did not hire a single optical engineer or chemical scientist. They simply bought the legal right to use the word Polaroid. Over the next 2 decades, the global market flooded with bizarre, unrelated products bearing the trusted name. Consumers walked into discount electronic stores and found Polaroid-branded LED televisions. They found cheap digital picture frames, generic Android tablets, portable DVD players, and low-quality headphones. The holding companies licensed the name to foreign manufacturers who assembled generic electronics in overseas sweatshops. They slapped the famous rainbow logo onto the plastic shells to create a false sense of heritage. The name that once represented the absolute peak of American optical science now represented generic, disposable junk. Polaroid became a zombie brand. It walked among the living retail markets, but it possessed absolutely no soul. It had no connection to the genius of instant film. It survived only to trick unaware consumers into buying cheap electronics based on fading nostalgia. Back in Massachusetts, the massive physical factories faced a much slower, quieter death. The sprawling manufacturing complexes in Waltham, New Bedford, and Cambridge emptied out. Some buildings eventually found new corporate owners and transformed into modern office spaces or laboratories for biotechnology firms. Others simply sat empty and abandoned for years. Wind blew through broken industrial windows. Rust slowly consumed the massive steel holding tanks that once held millions of gallons of proprietary developer jelly. The very specific, metallic smell of silver halides and chemical solvents faded away permanently. It was replaced by the smell of damp concrete and rot. The half-century of frantic, non-stop production ended in total, heavy silence. The machines that printed billions of physical memories were melted down for scrap metal. Business schools across the United States now use Polaroid as a primary case study. Professors do not teach it as a simple story of a company beaten by a faster, smarter competitor. They teach it as a terrifying story of a company imprisoned by its own flawless business model. The razor and blade strategy generated too much cash. The profit margins on the physical instant film were so incredibly high that the executive board simply could not imagine abandoning them. The executives did not fail because they were stupid. They failed because they were completely trapped by their own financial success. They looked at the early digital cameras and saw a product with terrible profit margins. A digital camera consumed no film. It required no chemical refills. It generated no recurring revenue. The executives chose to protect the high-margin product that was actively dying over the low-margin product that was taking over the entire world. They successfully maximized their quarterly profits right up until the moment the company went bankrupt. Their success acted as a heavy, unbreakable chain. This final executive failure stands in sharp, painful contrast to the philosophy of the founder. Edwin Land constantly destroyed his own products. He intentionally killed his highly successful peel-apart film to create the SX70 camera system. He understood a fundamental law of technological progress. Innovation requires brutal cannibalization. A company must be willing to burn down its current success to invent its future. When the corporate accountants forced Land out of his own boardroom in the early 1980s, they removed the only man who possessed the courage to destroy the factories and start over. The death of Polaroid leaves a haunting question for modern corporate leaders. When a company builds a perfect product, and that product generates billions of dollars in pure cash every single year, does anyone in the boardroom have the bravery to kill it? When the financial spreadsheets look completely flawless today, who is willing to intentionally destroy the balance sheet to ensure the company survives tomorrow? The answer is almost always no one. The white-bordered photograph remains an iconic physical artifact of the 20th century. It fundamentally changed how human beings recorded their daily lives. It delivered the magic of instant gratification decades before the internet or the smartphone even existed. It allowed ordinary people to hold a piece of time in their hands exactly 60 seconds after the moment occurred. But the massive corporation that created that magic forgot a basic rule of survival. The world never stops moving. Polaroid built a massive, impenetrable fortress of chemistry, mechanics, and patents. They locked the heavy gates. They focused entirely on counting their massive piles of money. They optimized their assembly lines perfectly. And while they were looking inward at their own brilliance, the digital future simply walked right past them, leaving nothing behind but empty factories and faded photographs.